Member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, Parliament has drunk the Kool-Aid. Labor and Liberal have well and truly drunk the Kool-Aid, and presumably we're sitting here late tonight because at the appointed hour the free trade saviour is going to come and take us to a better place. Never has there been a more apparent instance where bipartisanship, when it chooses to ignore the evidence and ignore government departments, flips over into collective self-delusion. When you have not just the unions, but the Productivity Commission and the Treasury saying, hang on, we don't think the benefits are actually what you say they are, and we think the costs are much higher than anyone is talking about, perhaps we ought to sit down and take a closer look. But instead, Parliament is being given a take-it-or-leave-it agreement that contains a provision that not even John Howard was prepared to sign up to, that has no analysis by Treasury or Productivity Commission of the benefits, and contains holes so big that you could fly plane loads of exploited and underpaid overseas workers through. If there is ever any case for saying that our treaty-making process is broken, it is this. When we are being given a take-it-or-leave-it agreement where all of the stakeholders and the Treasury and the Productivity Commission don't get the chance to look at it beforehand, and we are being told, take it on faith that it will deliver all these wonderful benefits that we're told about, and then we're being told, just sit here till we need to, the latest possible tonight, to pass it through, Parliament and the treaty-making process are well and truly broken. Now, we need to reflect on something that our Prime Minister and Opposition Leader are about to do. Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten are about to agree to something that not even John Howard would agree to. Parliament is about to rubber stamp an agreement that contains a provision that will allow overseas corporations to sue the Australian government when the Australian government passes laws in the public's interest but that affect these companies' profits. Now, these clauses are called Investor-State Dispute Settlement Clauses, ISDS clauses. What it means is this. Parliament passes a law that says we might want to protect people's health, or we want to look after the environment. Then a company from, in this instance, China, is able to come and sue the Australian government and say, you are affecting our profits and we want that law changed. And those clauses are then, those cases are then dealt with by a secret panel, not of judges, but of appointed people in a secret panel, and they get to decide whether or not Parliament gets told to change its law. In other words, an overseas company is able to say, through a secret disputes panel, the Australian Parliament must change its law. And this provision, and members opposite are saying that's simply not true. This provision, this investor-state dispute settlement provision that's contained in this agreement, is open-ended. It says we want to be able to have the right to give our companies to sue Australian government over a variety of matters, and we'll get around later to telling you what those matters are. DFAT said, when they gave evidence to the Senate inquiry about it, that China will know what it wants in these clauses once it's completed bilateral negotiations with the EU and the US. So, in other words, we've got to wait for a couple of years to find out what this agreement is going to contain that will allow overseas companies to sue Australian governments. In Canada, government said, we want to put a moratorium on coal seam gas development until we work out what it means for our people and our agriculture, and a company sued them for it. They said, we want to restrict the use of certain pesticides or fertilisers, and they got sued. And the thing about getting sued is that it doesn't matter whether the outcome of what the outcome of the case is a lot of the time. The fact that governments worry about getting sued means governments then are less likely to pass laws to protect their people, to protect their environment, to protect their farmers, to protect their local economy. And that's exactly what these agreements are about. It's not about free trade, it's about a new blueprint that means Australian Parliament and Australian democracy is subservient to a panel that gets to decide what happens when a corporation sues a government. And I said before to Mr Deputy Speaker that the benefits of this are overstated. We have been told that this is a cornerstone of Australia's future prosperity. We have been told that this will usher in an era of unprecedented growth. OK, so give us some evidence. OK, so give us some evidence. If that's the case, you as the government, you've got a whole series of departments at your disposal. You've got a productivity commission at your disposal. Give us some evidence about the benefits that are going to come from it. One of them we've been told, is jobs. We've been told that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs that are going to flow from this. The minister has said, and indeed in the Senate it's been said by the government, modelling shows that between 2016, as a result of all the free trade agreements, there will be 178,000 additional jobs, on average 9,000 extra jobs a year. And they were referring there, and they based that on a Centre for International Economics report. Nothing from the government, nothing from Treasury, nothing from Productivity Commission on an international report. What they didn't realise is that they'd misread the table. They'd added up. The table went through and said, in this year, here's how many jobs it will create. In this year, here's how many jobs. That was a point in time. It wasn't cumulative. The government went through and added it all up and said over 100,000 new jobs. You know what? When you work out from that report how much is going to come from this agreement and you make an estimate, about 3,300 jobs by 2035. 3,300 jobs. Okay? That is the only evidence. Now, if that was wrong, you would imagine the government lining up with Treasury paper and Productivity Commission paper and saying you've got it wrong. They don't. They don't, because they've drunk the Kool-Aid and they want us to drink it, and they're not prepared to come with anything other than rhetoric. Well, I'm not prepared to accept rhetoric. What we do know, and again, the government has not contradicted this, is that when we remove tariffs, we remove revenue from tariffs. So in other words, over the next 20 years, expect the impact from this agreement to be a $40 billion hit to the budget. $40 billion hit to the budget. $40 billion for 3,300 jobs, that's about $12 million a job. Thanks to this government, we're paying $12 million to create a job, one of 3,300 jobs. And so when this parliament chooses, because of this collective delusion that Labor and Liberal are buying into, to ignore what Treasury is saying, because when Treasury came up to the Senate committee, they said, look, we actually think that the impact on, when they were asked about it, they said that if they incorporated the supposed benefits of these trade agreements into our nation forward protection of GDP, they said it wasn't substantive enough to make a difference. That's what your Treasury said, not substantive enough to make a difference. And your Productivity Commission said, we don't think the benefits are what they're told. Give us a chance to model it. They've said no. You would imagine that the government would be lining up report after report, and they can't. And they can't. And Labor's swallowed it. And we're told that tariff reductions are going to mean so much for exporters. Well, when it comes down to a few cents per bottle or per serve of beef, you don't have to think very hard to think that the movement of the Australian dollar overnight could completely wipe that out. We have got more to worry about for our exporters with the level of the Australian dollar and its rise and fall than we do with tariffs. And so you would imagine, again, the government would come along and make a persuasive case, and they haven't. What they're also hiding on is the very important question of what this means for the workforce, here and overseas. There should be a simple starting point. Whether you come from overseas or whether you're local, everyone should be paid local wages and conditions, and no one should be exploited. That should be the simple starting point. That should be the simple starting point. But as I said, in this agreement today, because Labor has caved in to the government, We are now about to pass an agreement
that I would use.
that contains no protections that will be enshrined in legislation. The only minimal protections, and I'll come to the quality of those in a moment, that have been negotiated are in regulation. So in other words, Labor is saying to us, we are putting our faith in the Liberal Workplace Relations Minister of the day not to repeal those regulations, and that's good enough for us. That's good enough for us. What we do know is that there are holes in this agreement that are big enough to fly plane loads of underpaid and exploited overseas workers through. Because what is crystal clear is that there is a whole category of visas and workers that are available under this agreement, and they're called contractual service suppliers, that won't be touched by anything that the Labor opposition negotiated today. And in fact, at least the Leader of the Opposition had the courage to admit that in Parliament when he said today Labor still remains concerned at how broadly the government has defined contractual service suppliers in Chapter 10 of CHAFTA, given its agreement to remove labour market testing for these workers. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, it means if you are a company here, you can bypass any requirement to advertise locally just by badging one of the workers that you're importing as one of these contractual service suppliers, which could be an engineer, which could be an electrician, which could be a retail worker.
Order.
You can
Order.
bring them in and not have to go through the process of advertising locally.
Workers that were put off in Moranbah last week.
That means
Order. Member for Kennedy.
people who are working,
Go and tell it to them.
people in
If you've got the
Victoria,
courage,
people
which
in
I doubt.
Victoria who are working on maintaining our electricity
Well, you go and
network.
tell it to them. It's
Okay,
supposed to be a
the
labour-
electricity
The member
network
be
in
heard in
Victoria,
silence.
the electricity network in Victoria
CFM,
that
you're
powers
waiting
everyone's
for it.
homes. Most people would expect that the people working on that you'd at least advertise locally, and that you'd go overseas if you couldn't find local labour. Well, now you just have to call someone a contractual service supplier or call them an installer under another provision, and you get to bypass all these so-called protections that have been negotiated, and you just get to bring them in. And that is why these so-called protections have massive holes in them, and why we shouldn't be supporting this agreement. It's another of the reasons that we shouldn't be supporting this agreement. And I could go on. There's nothing in this agreement about ensuring that minimum environmental conditions aren't undercut. That could have been something that was negotiated, and that's not there. And so we're given a take-it-or-leave-it agreement that, as I said, contains a provision that not even John Howard was prepared to sign up to. Contains a provision that John Howard was not even prepared to sign up to. And so we have, in many ways, a crossing of a Rubicon here. We have a crossing of a Rubicon because this parliament, with the full support of the opposition, is about to sign up to something that contains an ISDS clause, an open-ended ISDS clause. Okay? And so if we're about to do that, then an open-ended— did you sign up to an open-ended ISDS clause before? There's interjections that we've already done. I don't recall this parliament ever signing up to something that says we're going to sign away our sovereignty to some overseas corporations and we'll tell you about what range of matters later. This is pretty unprecedented. This is pretty unprecedented.
It's happening
So
now. You people initiate
here we
it.
have
Go
Order.
initiate it.
a situation where
Well, you go and tell them at Moranbah.
standing up for sovereignty,
Go down there and visit them.
The member for Kennedy and the
standing
member
up
for Griffith.
for a
Order.
basic principle that says we should advertise locally first and then welcome someone in to come and work here afterwards if we can't find local labour, and the basic principle that says let's have some evidence of economic benefits before we pass it, has been completely abrogated.
Thanks to
This
your
government, who came up and tore shreds off Labor when they were in power for not having a productivity commission analysis of the NBN, is now asking us to sign up to something that doesn't even have a Treasury analysis or a productivity commission analysis or any reputable analysis underpinning it. Well, I'm not prepared to do that. I'm not prepared to say that this parliament writes an open-ended cheque to overseas companies to tell us how we're allowed to legislate for the benefit of our people, and I hope that the rest of the parliament doesn't either.
Hear, hear.